Good morning. I'm here today to read aloud the notes for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. All energy for living things comes from food. Originally, that energy in food comes from the sun. So ultimately, all of our energy comes from our sun. It just depends on how far along that energy is in the process. So, organisms that use light energy from the sun to produce food are known as autotrophs. Auto meaning self, and trophs meaning feeding, so self feeding. So, any plants, the fancy word for, in science to explain plants is autotrophs. Plants and some microorganisms, those microorganisms could be some types of different bacteria, again, that are green, and protists. Protists is a kind of a catch all category. They're very, very diverse kingdom. But generally speaking, when you talk about autotrophs, you think about different plants. Organisms that cannot use the sun's energy to make food are known as heterotrophs. Heterotroph, or different, that's what hetero means, and then troughs meaning feeding. So for an example, animals and most microorganisms, aka bacteria, are going to be known as heterotrophs. So here's a bunch of different pictures of different organisms that are heterotrophs. You and I are heterotrophs because we can't use the sun's energy to make our own food. So of course we're going to talk about that fancy word known as photosynthesis today. Photosynthesis is the process by which the energy from the sun, is converted into energy of glucose. Glucose is another fancy word for sugar. So if you look at a plant, this is just a leaf for an example. A plant needs sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and then they will produce oxygen and glucose. Again, glucose is another fancy word for sugar. The xylem part transports water up from the roots through the trunk and branches to the leaves, which is then used for photosynthesis. So xylem is the fancy word for the tubes that carry water inside of the plant. How do plants take in carbon dioxide? Well, it's a pretty kind of cool way at which they work. Plants get carbon dioxide from the air through their leaves. Specifically, there's these little structures called stomata. The carbon dioxide diffuses through the small holes on the underside of the leaf called the stomata. One of these holes is called a stoma. Okay, so that's kind of another visual for you. Typically, if you think take a rubber glove, and then if you were to blow that up with just air, just to kind of show for a model's sake, I'd do this in the classroom if we were there. You could take two of those fingers, and if it's the plant is freshly watered, full of water, hydrated, those fingers would be full. Right. And then there would be a big opening if you held both of those two parts of the finger together, and that's the stomata. Okay. So the stoma or the stomata is actually the structure at which allows the water, if there's enough water, to keep it open. However, if the plant is dehydrated or not getting enough water, think of that as a deflated glove, right? That opening, that hole will not be open, and in exchange the photosynthesis will not take place. So that's why it's really important to water your plants so that the stoma or the stomata can remain open so that photosynthesis can occur. The other magic part, which is you can see on the slide that is really important, is known as your chloroplast. So photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast of your plants. These have chloroplasts have something in them called chlorophyll, which that should ring a bell. They are light absorbing compounds, a pigment which will absorb wavelengths of light and reflect others. The color our eyes see is the color that the pigment reflects. So plants appear green because green light is actually being reflected off of plants, whereas all the other wavelengths of color will be absorbed by that in terms of energy. So chlorophyll is the pigment inside the chloroplast that absorbs light for photosynthesis. As the chlorophyll in the leaves decays in the autumn or the fall, the color green fades away and is replaced by the oranges and the reds of what we call the carotenoids or carotenoids. That's why our leaves, specifically here in New Jersey, here in Franklinville, they have a color change because they are from deciduous trees. Deciduous trees lose their leaves every fall, and you see those colors of the reds and the oranges and the yellows because there's the different pigments being absorbed. The general formula for photosynthesis, and this will kind of come up over the next couple days, it's basically your reactants in your products. So you've seen this before from 7th grade science. You need carbon dioxide, water, and light. CO2 is the fancy word for carbon dioxide. Water is H2O, and then light energy. And they produce glucose, which is a fancy word for sugar, and oxygen. Glucose is C6H12O6, and oxygen is O2. Okay, so that's the reactants and products. You'll see that a lot. And telling what do plants need, or that's your reactants. And then what is produced, that's your products. Okay, there's also a pretty cool brain pop right there that you can watch on photosynthesis to help reinforce that concept. Oh, here you go. I forgot that I put that on there. That's kind of the chemical formula for that. The second part is cellular respiration. There's two different types, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic means air or needing air. Anaerobic is not air, okay, or doesn't require oxygen. So needing oxygen or not requiring oxygen. So cellular respiration is the process by which the energy of glucose is released in the cell to be used for life processes, okay? So our body, our digestive system breaks down food, eventually getting absorbed by the small intestine, and then it will get absorbed into our body. Right? But we need oxygen in order to survive because that's part of the cellular respiration step. Cells require a constant source of energy for life processes, but only keep a small amount of ATP. ATP is the fancy word for energy. Cells can regenerate ATP as needed by using the energy stored in foods like glucose or any energy storing molecule. The energy stored in glucose by photosynthesis is released by cellular respiration and repackaged into the energy of ATP. Okay, so that's just kind of like, I think of ATP as a rechargeable battery. You can either have it on hand and it will charge up, and then it will be stored for later, and then it will charge up again. That's kind of why you get hungry. Different parts you eat kind of consistently because your body constantly needs that energy to do its work. This is a pretty cool way. Another TED Ed on photosynthesis. Pretty sure. I think it's only about 4 minutes too. You can check that out. So respiration occurs in all cells and can take place either with or without oxygen present. Aerobic requires oxygen, occurs in the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell. And this is your general formula. Anybody notice anything? Well, you should notice that it's basically the opposite of the photosynthesis equation. Okay, so if you look here, glucose and oxygen are used or yielded to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Okay, so that's happening in our bodies. That's your aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration occurs when no oxygen is available to the cell. And specifically in our bodies, we heard or have heard of lactic acid buildup. So we'll talk about that when you're in busy, hard exercising. You don't have enough energy or supplying oxygen to those cells, so it kind of temporarily holds it off. I'll talk about that on the next slide. The other is alcoholic respiration. Alcoholic as an example of anaerobic respiration. That's called fermentation. Fermentation is when cells in general can release energy from food without using oxygen. So a lot of our food byproducts are created through this. So alcoholic fermentation occurs in bacteria, yeast, and plants. Very commonly, it's even in the breads that you eat. Okay, so bread, making of beer, they're both common examples of alcoholic fermentation because it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide and a small amount of energy. The other one is lactic acid fermentation, which I said is more common in us, and that's in our muscle cells. So lactic acid is produced in the muscles during rapid exercise when the body cannot supply enough oxygen to the tissues, causing a burning sensation. So you may have experienced this, especially if you're an athlete. That's kind of lactic acid buildup in your muscle cells, and that's a type of anaerobic respiration. Okay, so as an overview, today we went over specifically photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is basically occurring in plants or autotrophs, which require three things. You need your water, you need your sunlight, and you need your CO2, carbon dioxide, and it produces glucose, which is a type of sugar, as well as outputs of O2. And then cellular respiration, there's two types. There's anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic does not require oxygen. Aerobic requires oxygen, and it occurs in a lot of different organisms in different ways. Okay, so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your teachers. Otherwise, have a great day.